me, because the sea is so large and my boat is so small. It's got a beautiful simplicity to it in English, in Irish and in Breton. And there's something about it that I wish us to think about in terms of poetry and prayer, each using form, each using terse language, and each using specificity and an ease of unadorned language also. Don Patterson recently released a book called The Poem, and it's an exhausting tome published by Faber this year, and it's a long exploration of the poem as metre and sign and lyric. It's gorgeous. And he describes in it the poem, he calls it a little machine for remembering itself. When he's asking what is a poem, a little machine for remembering itself. And then he and many others also consider where does poetry come from. Marie Howe suggests, the former poet laureate of New York State, suggests that the first poem was probably a lullaby, somebody making rhymes, making pieces with alliteration to communicate comfort while feeding a child, a mother feeding a child. That's her suggestion. But many people suggest that poetry is naturally occurring in human speech. I was once working with a class of students in West Belfast, and one of the students mentioned lesbians. This is a class of girls, and one of the other girls in the class said, "They're all disgusting." And one of the other girls in the class said, "Why would you say that?" And then another girl in the class said, "Because they just want to kiss me." And the final girl said, "That's because you think you're hot and you're not." And it was a naturally occurring mode of human speech. That's because you think you're hot and you're not. I've never forgotten it. It held itself together so perfectly. It was in itself a little machine for remembering itself, with rhyme, with rhythm. It was perfect. And so poetry really is seeking to land into the quotidian experience of language that remembers itself. That seems to be the idea. And the lyric tradition in poetry is the audacious assertion that the I, the person, with their feelings, with their world, with everything around them, can place themselves at the centre of a piece of literature. That would have been considered to have been relatively audacious. It still is, in a certain sense, audacious to think that you, yourself, could be the centre of a small universe that you're putting out there in the hope that it might be of value, not only to you, to have it proclaimed publicly, but also to other people. And I'd like to propose that prayer is not about putting the first person into the lyric poem. That prayer is the hope that you can put the second person into the lyric poem, and hope that somebody might be listening, hope that somebody might be understanding. And I'd like to put it forward too that even if there isn't somebody listening or understanding, it's no bad thing to put the second person into a poem anyway, because even if there isn't, we can make it up, and it might be beneficial if we make it up. Just like hope, often there is no reason to hope, but hope often works because hope often works. And this is something that we can do in the context of prayer, in this realm of finding language that can remember itself, and not just remember itself in terms of remember its repetition, but remember itself. We can put ourselves back into being by having something that supposes, that posits a second person who might be listening, a you. And in that small Breton prayer, it's almost like there's an imperative. Help. In Irish, tuair aradam, mind me, give minding to me. It's declaring it, it's demanding it. So there's a you that's implied underneath all of this. It's addressed to somebody without that somebody having been named explicitly. Tuair aradam, mar is beag mo bhád, agus is mór in aige. My boat is so small, and the sea is so big. Mind me. That's what we're going to be thinking about today. What does it mean to enter into this realm of prayer through poetic form, through poetic language, and through poetic license with the biblical inheritance, in order to think that there can be an audacious entry of self into these inherited texts, to say something that might reveal self to self, that might help us remember ourselves in the here and now, that there might be something in the form of prayer and in the form of poetry that can open us up to the possibility of what does it mean to be alive, and how it is that in the human condition, which does need to reckon with loneliness, and serious loneliness, and with death, and with the fact that things will end, how is it that poetry and prayer can be some kind of comfort? Lots of what we're going to look at today, and you'll have some poems there, are poems that seek to take a biblical narrative and enter into it with imagination. Enter into it with a sense of forming it and making it for yourself. And there is precedent for this. You find the earliest words of the Hebrew narrative in terms of the recording of the Bible. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. At the beginning of God's creating. You find then the Gospel of John in the beginning. He demonstrated a lovely act of poetic license. He took form and reformed it. He took something that probably people who had written it would not have been too happy for him to have reformed into his understanding of this Messiah, but he did it anyway. He took it, he stole it. Good poets borrow, great poets steal, Meg Carney says in her poem Creed, and she should know that very well because she stole that from TS Eliot. And he stole it from W.H. Davenport Williams, who hated his work and accused him of simply being somebody who pilfered language, and he took it and turned it into a compliment for himself. And then Meg Carney took it and turned it into a line of her own in one of her own poems exploring religion. And so to take the biblical literature is something that I believe we need to be audacious in doing, because this is great world literature. And in as much as we find people engaging with Beowulf or the great Greek sagas, the Icelandic sagas, or all of the great Nordic myths, or the various myths of gods from all around the Mediterranean, I have seen over the last while an increase in poets, not necessarily religious poets, but poets who are taking the biblical literature and entering into it for the deliberate sense of reforming it to shape the chaos of their own world. So here's a little bit of chaos of my own. There's an extraordinary narrative that you find in the Hebrew Bible about Abraham binding Isaac on top of a mountain to offer Isaac as an offering to God. And it's a really intriguing text because Abraham takes him up, and Abraham seems caught in this frenzy because it says that the voice of the Lord came to Abraham. Abraham, this voice said, go and take your son up to the top of the mountain. And Abraham does this. And there's this voice that interjects into Abraham's conscious and unconscious regularly, and each time it starts off by saying his name. And finally, when Abraham is about to slice the throat or the chest of his own son Isaac, who, according to Aviva Zornberg, was a man in his 20s, not some innocent 6-year-old, just as this is about to happen, the angel of the Lord stops Abraham doing that, but has to say his name twice. Abraham, Abraham. And there are books written about why, at this very moment that Abraham should have been desperate not to have enacted, why did the voice have to come? Why did his name have to be repeated twice? What was happening there? Was he caught up to frenzy? Did it correspond with something deep in him, or maybe he did wish to see death happening right in front of him? Anyways, he doesn't kill his son, but they don't go down the mountain together. He goes down the mountain to go home to find his wife Sarah dead, and Isaac goes down the mountain and follows Hagar into the desert. And they never see again. And Abraham, the great patriarch, never passes on a blessing to his son. So Isaac is the unblessed, really. And so Isaac has to turn to God for a really second-hand blessing, an inadequate blessing that presumably Isaac would have much rather have come from his actual father, not some unseen father. It's a long question as to why is it that Sarah died. And there's a later midrash. Midrash is like the psychoanalysis of the text. There's a later midrash that suggests that maybe the devil, so you know that it's a very late midrash because the devil's suddenly been invented. And there's a later midrash that suggests that while Abraham was up the mountain with Isaac, that Sarah was waiting on their homestead, and the devil appeared to her and nonchalantly asked, "Where's your husband?" And she said, "I don't know." And he said, "I do. He's up a mountain about to kill Isaac." "No, he's not." "Yes, he is." "No, he's not." "Yes, he is." And Sarah died of shock. And so Isaac never sees his mother again. So the sacrifice of this whole time is the wife of Abraham, Sarah. And then we see that later on, Isaac never sees his father again. And then he marries Rebecca. And it says that when he sees Rebecca, she shades herself. She pulls a veil over her face. And he brings her into his tent. And the word for tent in Hebrew is the same as the word for darkness. So he brings her into his darkness. And it says in the text in Genesis, and there he's comforted after the death of his mother. So you see in this an extraordinarily sophisticated psychological text. Ways in which family relations overlap each other. Ways in which dysfunctional families are nothing new. Over and over again we see the complex interweaving of people, and that God is almost a compromise in this whole thing. And so here's a poem called Family Tree. They say Satan teased Sarah while her husband tied their son up on a mountain. It's an old story. A man tests the limits of religion while the devil's on a mission to a woman. The devil said, "He's dead." Oh wait, he's not. Sarah heard a gunshot and did the only thing she could. She reached beyond herself and died. Meanwhile, Isaac sees a frenzy on the face of a patriarch and an angel screaming out her name, and everything's going dark. Afterwards they never spoke again. One went his way and the other went another. Isaac's mother dead, he followed Hagar to the desert. Hagar married Abraham, but Isaac stayed away, didn't even send a text. He pulled the blinds down, tried to rest, then his father died, so God blessed Isaac. Isaac never quite recovered from the loss. Then Rebecca came along and saw it all. She'd studied Freud, so knew her boys would tell stories that their father couldn't bear. She tore her hair out, then devised a plan, but even she was foiled. Her boys grew up. Her boys forgot the bitter fights of childhood, spat out herbs and limped towards each other when the angels settled down at last. There may not be a God or a Sarah. There may not be a garden or a man who ordered soup up to his room. There may not be a mountain, but there's always been a woman with the truth, and there's always been a brother full of shame. There's always been a story, and there's always been a devil in the details. For me, the entry into these texts is something that is really important, because the idea is that by reading the text and entering audaciously into the text begins to read you back. And you find in the conversation between self and text something that echoes the conversation between self and you. Something that opens us up not to a personal lyric, but to something that might be considered an interpersonal lyric, even if it's only with the narrative you're creating. Even if it's only with the words that are being formed in front of you, some kind of relationship between self here and self that's on the page, and the self that's on the page that knows something deeper than the self that's narrating the self seems to know. And this in itself can be sufficient to call it prayer. I think you've all got a sheet of paper. Is that right? Is there anybody who doesn't have one? No, good. Okay. So what I'd like us to do first of all is I'd like us to look at this one, The Prodigal's Mother Prays to God by Alison Funk, from the book The Knot Garden with Sheep Meadow Press. Can I check, are people, most people here, or would anybody benefit from me doing a quick hop, skip and a jump through the prodigal son story? Would that be beneficial? Would anybody need that? We're okay? Okay, so one of the interesting things about the prodigal son story, it's in Luke, and only in Luke chapter 15, in a chapter that explores narratives of lost things, lost coin, lost sheep, lost son. And Luke is a very equitable gospel. Whenever Luke has a parable or a story about a man, he has a corresponding parable or story about a woman. Over and over again you see that Luke has a very deep interest in a particular demonstration of gender balance. Over and over he prepares, and indeed he begins almost pejoratively with 2 silent men and 2 vocal women. And so it's a really important thing to recognize then this strange anomaly in the story of the prodigal son, in that there are no women with voice and there's only one, as far as I know, disparaging reference to women. "You and your loose women," the older son accuses his brother. So Alison Funk has done a very interesting thing by her intervention into the biblical witness here, even with her title, The Prodigal's Mother. Praise to God. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read it, and then I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. There's a whole lot in this, extraordinary imagination and courage and poetic form also, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, and then we'll have a conversation. The Prodigal's Mother, praise to God. When he returned a second time, the straps of his sandals broken, his robe stained with wine, it was not as easy to forgive. By then his father was long gone himself, leaving me with my other son, the sullen one, whose anger is the instrument he tunes from good morning on. I know there's no room for a man in the womb, but when I saw my youngest coming from far off, so small he seemed, a kid unsteady on its legs. She-goat, what will you do, I thought, remembering when he learned to walk. Shapeshifter, it's like looking through water. The heat bends, it blurs everything. Brush, precipice, a shambles between us. So I'd love to hear what it is that you notice in this. If you come in quiet, I know what you notice. I can see there's some poetry for you to have a look at there. Just a screen.
It's really nice that bit where it's like looking through water, the heat blends, there and blood, everything. And there's this sense of like all of these kind of relations that have been established in all these people.
Yeah.
Suddenly kind of dissolving.
Yeah.
And it's into this shambles and trying to tell a story but then trying to sort of untell it in a way and kind of, yeah.
Yeah. It is an extraordinary thing that she does, and you picked up on that, and I think it's a very brave thing that she does here, because the poem up until that point has got quite a coherent narrative. You know, you're learning information, you're getting these new points of view, etc., and you're able to follow it along. And then, quite extraordinarily, this poem goes into what feels like a declaration of the unconscious. It's like looking through water. The heat bends, it blurs everything. Brush, precipice. It's like she's in a dream and we're in this dream with her, and these images are coming towards us. And the poem itself undoes its fairly coherent narrative. And I think that's very brave, because it could have been easy to have thought, let me just enter right into the narrative and leave it. But she enters right into the narrative and lets the narrative dissolve. And I think that's a really interesting. And Paige Lewis, who is an American poet, has done a similar thing recently in Poetry magazine. And Paige has done this thing where it starts off, I think, in iambic pentameter, and this exquisite, sharp, acidy poem, and then it utterly dissolves in form, moves all across the page, totally explodes. And it's a really interesting thing to hear them speak this poem, Paige Lewis, and to see a similar thing where to go from strict form to absolute formlessness is a way that the poem itself is telling itself and unraveling itself deliberately. What else do you notice?
For me, one of the themes is the power that the child has for, you know, speaking as a parent, I've got my son here, but in the early verses where it talks about the straps of his sandals broken, robe stained with wine, I'm thinking of Christ, but then right at the end of the poem, shapeshifter, shambles, I'm thinking more of Antichrist, and there's that power for this child could be my glory, it could be my shame, and yeah, so just huge archetypal kind of themes there, but
enormous,
just sort of just brushstrokes really, but
I know.
Yeah.
It is, I mean, there is such tenderness in this whole thing, and you're right, you don't know, because there's all these images happening there, and there's a reference to no room for a man in the womb, thinking about you must be born again. How does that mean, should I be born again? And so she takes all this biblical inheritance, and she undoes it, she picks at it, she picks at the threads, and causes it to be taken apart, and by the end you're not sure what's left, God, or her family, or anybody. In the end, there's just shambles.
That I know.
I know.
It's So, well, it's where can it go? It could go either way. Like it's in more or less the middle as well. It's sort of it feels in what tone is she saying that, and what is it referring to? We don't really know. And so that feels to me like kind of the difficulty of knowing somebody else, I suppose.
I know. It's. I mean, I think that is my favourite line in the whole poem. And it's a stanza, it's not just a line, because it stands there right by itself. And 2 words, almost an echoing of Jesus wept in the tercity of 2 words. And what does she know? And how is it that our intuition goes into the sense of, yeah, we know too. But if you were asked to go, write out the things you know that she knows, you go, well, I don't know. But I feel this, I know this through feeling. This is a kind of a knowing of the gut, a knowing of intuition, a knowing of grief almost, a knowing of things falling apart. It's a really interesting study in end-stop lines, this poem too. Like, look at this. When he returned a second time, the straps of his sandals broken, his robe stained with wine, it was not as easy to forgive. That's a beautifully melodic 4-line sentence going across 2 stanzas. And then, by then, his father was long gone himself, leaving me with my other son, the sullen one, whose anger is the instrument he tunes from good morning on. Another single sentence across 2 stanzas, and then, I know, what does that do to the breath? Because one of the things that poetry does in the embodiment of reading it out loud is that poetry challenges you to know, where do I take a breath? Do I take a breath at the end of a line, at the end of a sentence, at a semicolon, at a comma? Can I take it wherever? And so poetry requires the reader, if they're reading it out loud, to know where to take a breath. And breath is always the thing of spirit, because they're from the same word in English and in Hebrew. Ruach in Hebrew, breath, a name for God also. Spirit in English, coming from spirare in Latin, also breath, but from which we get spirituality and aspirate. And so we see over and over again that questions to do with spirituality are intrinsically linked with the breath, which is intrinsically linked with the body, and an absolutely earthed, embodied reality about the question of where do I breathe. And she causes us to do this in the reading out loud of this extraordinary poem. I want to ask the question, and I don't have one answer to this. I think this is deliberately left open, and so I'm just curious to know what you think. Who is the she-goat? What's happening? Bearing in mind the title, because I think that might be where the title comes into all of this. But I'm really curious to know what you think, who you think the she-goat is.
To me, it was the mother, the person who voiced the poem. The poem, you've got that previous line, the kid unsteady on its legs.
Yeah.
The kid is both the child, but then also like the goat, the kid. And so then she goat, it's just a sense, it's both referring to her, but also expressing her own affection, and it ties into all these ideas about shepherds and flocks in a way that it's a goat, what does one make of that?
Yeah. It's very, the idea of the goat and, separating the goat from the sheep and all of this kind of thing. She certainly is the mother of the goats. So you think that she's speaking to herself, addressing herself? I think all of it, whatever you say, I think is an entire possibility. I don't think the poem gives us a key for one clear interpretation of that, but I'd love to hear.
I suppose it might equally be the divine response to the prayer, and especially in terms of this idea of there being a shambles between us, and it's the same idea of gulfs between human individuals being paralleled by the gulf between the divine and man, that potentially comes up again here, and in the sense that this lost child is as much God's child as it is the mother's child, and that's really the point of the parable in Luke.
Yeah. So you're saying it could be God speaking to her. God is calling her she-goat. What will you do? I think it's possible too that she's speaking to God. She-goat, what will you do? She's calling God she-goat. What an extraordinary name to give God. she-goat. One of the things I really like about biblical interpretation and poetic interpretation is that the whole aim is to put all kinds of intelligent possibilities on the table and to sit between the tension created and the harmony or disharmony created between holding all of these possible interpretations at the one time, rather than trying to be supremacist about it, to say, here is the answer, this is what this means. I was doing my undergrad in theology, and I was so annoyed because during the Gospel of John module we had a few different teachers, and each of them were absolutely definitive about why it was that Jesus wept at the grave of Lazarus, and they were dismissive of any other theory. And to my mind there was theology to be done on supremacy there. Why do we need one? Who told us that one is a good number? Who told us that that was a good idea? To always be looking for the right or the correct thing, the certain thing. That seemed to be more akin to addiction to me than intelligence. And I'm interested with poetry how it is that we can intelligently hold multiple interpretations here together. And to do that also about the spiritual life. We don't know. Are we alive or dead? Is there a heaven or a hell or an afterlife? Are we created or we're just here? We don't know. And what do we do with all of the possibilities that lay in front of us? And how do they impact the present? And I think poetry and biblical interpretation have a lot to say to each other in forming theories and holding multiple intelligent theories together at a time. And intelligence is across all the senses. An intuitive intelligence, an intellectual intelligence, all kinds of intelligences for interpretation. I feel like there's a question, a possible critique in this too, in the prodigal son parable that you get in the Gospel of Luke. I mean, it's pretty clear that the whole interpretation of this is that the father is the God character. I mean, it's very straightforward. That's the interpretation that's being put across. But I think it's an interesting thing to ask simply from the parable's point of view, and then to relate that to our own lives. Was there a good reason to leave? We always just think that the younger son who asked for his inheritance was just leaving because, you know, he's a bit of a waster. But we all know that there's good reason to leave. And so when we see this, by then his father was long gone himself, one sees the beginning of a critique of this father character, and this solitary interpretation of father in this parable, which is just a story within a story. We see the beginning of a critique. How do you read long gone himself? I'm not looking for one, I'm curious about the possible plurals.
Well, it may just be that he's died. That's a fairly kind of innocent explanation, or it could be that he has actually actively left.
Yeah.
And both of them fit perfectly with the expression of that phrase, long gone.
Long gone himself, yeah, totally. Yeah.
I was thinking that because of the, that this is the son's second leaving and coming, that it seemed that perhaps the father was unwilling to go through it again, but she was, and she, she admits it wasn't easy to forgive this time, but she's still there, sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it brings in, jumping back up there, it brings in a big question, both about forgiveness and about addiction, because I think there is addiction is implied, not mentioned directly, but implied of here. A second time, robe stained with wine, you see a repeated pattern, you see an incapacity or an unwillingness or whatever to cease from what had come before. And what you see in this suddenly is a way within which the biblical narrative is speaking to something about repeated patterns, and also implying, because the Gospels tend to be filled with these stories of these one-off encounters, and they're amazing, they're fantastic. I mean, Mark's Gospel and Luke's Gospel are filled with these one-off encounters with marginalized characters, where the marginalized characters are being praised, and then the disciples are being cast really as the anti-heroes, because they keep on neglecting to understand the deeper message. But this asks us to think about, but what happened afterwards? Did anything change? Did certain patterns continue? Did people continue to make mistakes? And we begin to recognize our own lives in that, the repeated patterns of our own lives. I'd like to turn to the other side of the page now. We're going to look at 2 poems from Marie Howe. And Marie Howe is the former Poet Laureate of New York. She's an extraordinary poet. She tends to publish 1 book every decade, and this came out in 2017, so I'm expecting the next one in about whatever, 2027. She is a poet who brings an enormous kind of Catholic imagination, Catholic biblical, literary and liturgical imagination into her work. One of her books is called The Kingdom of Ordinary Time, picking up on the whole cycle of ordinary time you see in the liturgical cycle. Another book is called The Good Thief, once again coming into this whole story that we find in the crucifixion. There's another book called What the Living Do, which is a long and aching book, which won some extraordinary prizes, written in the wake of her youngest brother's death from AIDS. And it's a fascinating book that brings religion and the body and love and trauma and death and weaves them all together in a really coherent single work that is really worthwhile reading from start to finish all at one go. The book that this year from is the 2017 book, Magdalene. And what Magdalene does is it explores the world through the lens of this character, Mary Magdalene. Who is she? And we see Mary Magdalene in the biblical narratives, and then we see Mary Magdalene trying to hail a taxi, trying to figure out how to be a mother, trying to pay the bills, and figuring out what do I do because I'm so busy. And so Magdalene is this shapeshifter herself over and over throughout it. And Marie Howe says that one of the complications of the Magdalene narrative, which is not just a biblical narrative but a world narrative, is that it continues to posit the question about women in literature. Are they virgins or whores? And caught between those 2 terrible ideas that are being put across, that not terrible in and of themselves, but terrible in the sense of those seem to be the only 2 exclusionary binary options that are put forward regarding women in some ancient literatures. And what Marie Howe is doing is populating the in-between space where she says, you can be many. So it's an amazing book. I actually read it this morning on my way over, simply because I knew we'd be looking at it and I wanted to read the whole book again. Something to know about Marie Howe, and this is why I wanted to finish off as we were thinking about this, these spaces, is Marie Howe was always interested in the moment, like a moment of awakening, a moment of extraordinary knowledge. And then she's always interested in what was happening in the next room, or the day after. You know, we all know these great moments of our own lives. You know, there was the day that this happened. I got the great news. I got the awful news. And then Marie will want to go, yeah, but what happened then? We were talking once, and her brother Johnny, who so much of that book, What the Living Do, is about. She was talking about what was happening in the next room. And so I said, well, what happened after Johnny died? And she said, we were sitting in the kitchen. She's one of 9, so there was a lot of people around. And we were sitting in the kitchen, and somebody said, I'm hungry. Somebody said, I made sandwiches. Somebody said, you know I hate ham. And somebody else said, I'll take the ham sandwich. This ordinary, everyday, utterly forgettable experience that's in conversation with the worst moment of their lives up until that point. And so she's always interested in those kinds of everyday things. And you see this you see these 2 movements in these poems. So this is taken from John, and where there's this woman who was not Mary Magdalene, but this anonymous woman who has been caught in the very act of adultery, as it's said, which to my mind always makes it seem like a setup. And one always wonders, where was the man, and why wasn't he being stoned? And was he the person who was volunteered to be the one who would seduce her into a liaison for which she would then be punished? That, to my mind, is always in the inheritance of this complicated text in John's Gospel. So we see here, Magdalene, the woman taken in adultery. Teacher, they said to Jesus, the law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? You know how it is when your speeding car spins on the ice at night and you think, here it is. When the deer spring across the headlights. When you begin to slip down the steep and icy steps. Now imagine someone is about to push you. Someone you know, and then they don't. So I'm curious what you see in this poem, or what this poem sees in you. Back and here you're making a very interesting point that it's not quite as comforting as you think, because there isn't the sense of, oh, fantastic. There's the sense of that precipice was there with deliberation.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you read the story in John's Gospel, there is this overwhelming sense of this, you know, this man who was so gracious when the law said should stone, whatever. And maybe we do see it that way because everyone's looking at Jesus and no one's looking at the woman. You know, everyone's thinking about the amazing work of Jesus and not thinking about what she's going through. And I think this is, you know, from her, you know, looking at the woman, us looking at the woman and her looking at herself, whatever.
Yeah.
For her, maybe it was just, oh, here's this great teacher now who's going to finish it and finalize my death, and then it doesn't. And that sort of sense of relief, but less this sort of sense of, wow, the whole world is turned upside down and everything's changed, you know, because of this man.
Yeah. So one of the things that this does is it continues on in the 20th century tradition. Evan Dolan is another poet who does this, where it's really clear that the narrator in this personal lyric is female. And that in itself is a really important thing as a challenge really to the many centuries of inheritance where predominantly the narrator is male. And we see that in gospel literature too, where predominantly the narratorial voice seems to come from a man. And in this instance we aren't really caught up in this particular poem. We're not caught up in how wonderful Jesus is. We're caught up in how would she feel? Because presumably in this text from John, some of the men, if not many of the men, who were willing to throw stones were known to her. So, fine, you've been saved, grand. My God. Look at what they were willing to do, deliberately, possibly with a setup. And it brings you into a terrible moment. Poetry and spirituality and prayer, I think, needs to be adequate for moments of deep shock and needs to not be wordless in those moments where human aggression is uncovered. If prayer does not have a capacity to respond to human aggression in ourselves or in others towards us, well then it will be a very flimsy kind of prayer. Prayer does need to be muscular in its understanding of the human condition, both in its possibilities and in its terrors. And we see in this moment something akin to a prayer, something akin to going into a biblical narrative to try to open it up in a way that can be adequate. So we're going to move on, but something interesting to notice is, Marie Howe's work is very loose in form. It tends to follow patterns of speech, so there's great melody in it, but it doesn't follow any iambic pentameter or any particular rhyming sequences. But look at these first 5 lines and then contrast the 6th line simply through the lens of the sibilants in it, the S sounds. You know how it is when your speeding car spins on the ice at night and you think, here it is, when the deer spring across the headlights, when you begin to slip down the steep and icy steps. Now imagine someone is about to push you, someone you know, and then they don't. Extraordinary lack in that final line of sibilants that creates a different kind of cadence in those last 4 words that's quite contradictory, and then they don't. 4 little bullets to try to know, what do I do in the wake of this? The next one, Magdalene the next day. The world that would have gone on without me bargained and clattered, and I walked where I wanted, free of the pretense of family now, belonging to no one. Back to the place where he'd bent and written in the dust. He was man among men, he knew not to look at them. Whatever he'd scribbled in the dust wasn't there anymore, but he was, standing with his friends in the shade of the temple wall. I should say that it's entirely possible to read those last 3 lines in a different way. Whatever he'd scribbled in the dust wasn't there anymore, but he was standing with his friends in the shade of the temple wall. So, it's also a very strong possibility in that text. What occurs to you in the reading of this poem? This, while the first one has no, apart from the epigraph and the title, it doesn't in any way bring out the biblical furniture or the architecture of that particular story. This second one clearly does. You're right back there.
Just carrying on from what you said about how the last 2 lines can be read in almost completely different ways. Well, they have obviously completely different meanings, don't they? Because if it's, you know, but he was still there, then there's some proof in that. But if it's, but he was somewhere else standing with his friends, then that's going to just confirms her isolation.
Yeah. What else strikes you about this poem?
I think what strikes is a kind of sense of stasis, that even though Howe is kind of intervening and asking what might happen the next day, she's still coming back, and almost as if like you were talking in the last poem, that there's almost an expectation that it will just start again. That she's sort of exactly where she was, maybe sort of prostrate on the floor or something.
Yeah.
I don't know, for all of it, she doesn't seem to have changed very much. I get the sense of the free, the pretense of family seems sort of naive. And then you wonder about what next, or the what next. What does she do now?
Yeah.
Now that Jesus might have moved on, if he is
true. Yeah. I've been thinking about the word naive lately. I looked up the etymology of it, and you can look to nativus in Latin, and so we tend to use naive, and I'm not sure how you meant to use it, but often it has a pejorative context now. But interestingly, if it is linked etymologically to the idea of birth, well, there isn't all birth to be celebrated. And why should birth have to follow a repeated pattern? And what's wrong with being born? And so I agree with you, something is naive in this. Or in another way we could say, something has been born, and we wonder will it survive? Free of the pretense of family now. Maybe hostility made this character realize, I'm alone. I mentioned isolation, but maybe there is some kind of blissful isolation, or imaginative or creative isolation. That's a possibility in this poem. One possibility among many. What do you think of that line, he was man among men, he knew not to look at them?
It seems to me that that's sort of refusing to look at them, refusing to be drawn into that kind of, that sort of gang thing, that they're ganging upon her, and they're saying, well, this woman has done this terrible thing, Jesus, don't you think she should be stoned?
Yeah.
And he's separated himself, like he's isolated from that toxic male grouping.
True, yeah.
And that's freed her.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the interpretations that you're mentioning is a really interesting one. It's a question about masculinity and the escalation of conflict or aggression or violence. And so from my work with Corymeela, I spent a lot of time thinking about styles of conflict and styles and ways within which conflict escalates, and what does it mean to intervene in a conflict to de-escalate a conflict. And one of the things that happens in the context of a mob is that mob mentality reduces itself to its lowest common denominator, and you can see this in this narrative, that people are willing to do things as a group that they would not be willing to do as singular individuals. And one of the things that Jesus of Nazareth does by writing on the ground in this John 8 text is to intervene, to cause the mob to start to ask individual questions. what the hell is he writing? I don't know, I can't read. It's estimated about 4% of people at the time were able to read. And so he uses his privilege to cause them to disassemble. It's a really interesting conflict intervention model to cause a mob of people to disassemble through doing something like that, that causes A, curiosity, and probably self-recrimination, because I can't read, I don't know, what's he writing? Who cares what he's writing? But there's something really interesting that's being done there. And then the way that Marie Howe in this poem suggests that he wasn't looking at them. He was man among men, he knew not to look at them. Different cultures have different understandings of holding the gaze, and some cultures understand that the holding of the gaze is a mark of respect, other cultures understand that the holding of the gaze is a mark of deep aggression and challenge, particularly between elder and younger. I don't know what the context is here, but certainly the poem is suggesting something very powerful. Do you think, this is the last question about this poem before we talk briefly about collect, do you think that the narrator in the poem, what do you think she was going to do at the end of the poem? Would you have any? I don't have any ideas. I'm curious. What do you think?
She's returning to the place where the words are written.
A bit louder.
In my mind, it seems like she's returning to the place where the words are written because they haven't had an effect on the world around them. It seems like Jesus' forgiveness hasn't been accepted by everyone else because she now belongs to no one, and his forgiveness hasn't been kind of accepted by her family who maybe still reject her, which is why she's still suffering for the returns of family. And so I feel like she's returning to kind of like, did this actually happen? Did I actually get forgiven? But the words go.
Yeah. Okay, very interesting. Return to the scene of the crime to seek validation.
I also don't think she necessarily knows what has been written, because that whatever he scribbled in the dust wasn't there anymore puts her among this number of the illiterate. So it's possibly a kind of a returning to try and fathom a judgment that's been handed down to her by mechanisms that she doesn't understand, she doesn't necessarily have any access to the motivations of. And so there can't be that immediate sense of trust that you would have in that moment of knowing what someone's doing, of being able to see what someone's writing. And I think there is that, and I think that contributes to the sense of distance at the end, that he was standing with his friends in the shade of the temple wall, and even the framing of the disciples as friends,
yeah,
immediately it feels, if not derisive, then certainly kind of very casual to our ears, and puts her kind of not within this cultural group that understands and feels the role of Christ and the trust that man has in Christ.
I think what you're saying is very interesting, because there's something really curious in this poem about if we take the idea that prayer is often spoken about in the sense of bringing comfort and maybe an answer, prier, to pray, to ask. And if the idea that to ask is to require or to hope for an answer, in the poetry of Marie Howe and in many poetries that engage with biblical witness, one of the things that they open up is simply you're looking for an echo of yourself. Perhaps it's a very American thing, and carrying on from Whitman's Song of Myself, in the hope that you can hear something coming back to you where you begin to feel known, if only by yourself, or the you that knows itself can sing itself to you in a way that you didn't know previously. This might be something approaching prayer. This might be something approaching some kind of connection with the unconscious. This might be something that can bring consolation, if not certainty. And perhaps, I think, poetry suggests, perhaps that's enough, because it might begin to help us to feel like we matter, if only to ourselves, and that kind of mattering can give us a purpose for living in the midst of uncertainties elsewhere. I want to talk a little bit about the form of collect. I have been very interested for many years, I don't have any of these here, been very interested for many years in the form of collect, which you find across many of the Christian liturgical traditions, predominantly in the Anglican tradition. Collect is a small little block of a prayer. There are 5 folds to it, and the 5 folds are very simple to remember. The first fold is you address God. You give a name to the Lord God Almighty. She-goat, perhaps, might be a good one. And then you say something in the second fold about God, almost a bit of character development. And in the third fold of collect, you state your desire, your intention. You name your request in prayer. And then the fourth fold is you justify that request. You give a reason why. And normally the fourth part corresponds to the first and second. And in the fifth part, you finish off with a small word of praise, Amen, or in the name of Jesus, or something like that. So a very well-known example is Almighty God, you address God, to whom all hearts are open, all desires known. You do a little bit more of character development. Cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit. There's the third fold, the request. The fourth fold, the reason, that we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name. The fifth fold, I'm not Anglican, so I'm going to get it wrong, through Christ our Lord, something like that. In this form of collect you find a Trinitarian formula also, which some collects follow, but not all. But all formal collects follow that 5-fold sequence that you see there. The naming of God, or the giving of a name to God. The giving then of some character development. The third fold is to give to name your request. The fourth fold is to give a reason for that corresponds to the character development that you've done. And the fifth fold is to finish off with some form of intelligent and intended gratitude, or perhaps confidence, or perhaps hope. And I have been interested for a long time to ask, what would some collects that feel like they believe in uncertainty and doubt seem like? And how can we engage with this form in a way that our world can be narrated back to us in all kinds of complicated ways? So I got asked by Canterbury Press if I'd write a book of collects, and I said to them, are you sure? Because I'm not sure these would be very devotional. And they said, we're sure. So anyway, I'll read some of them for you. I'm interested in not always praying to God in prayer, and I wrote a book called Daily Prayer with the Corymeela Community, which has 31 collects corresponding to 31 days of any month. And today is day 24, so I thought we'd read this one. And the text that we have in Corymeela for today is this text: so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. It's a horrible text, Mark 15:15. And the part that I hate the most, really, is that little clause, the second clause, wishing to satisfy the crowd. And it makes me think about dynamics of conflict in our society today. How is it that individuals sense or intuit the aggression of a crowd, and we diminish our own integrity as a way to respond to that? And I think this is a way that the biblical witness reflects humanity back to humanity. Over and over again we find situations where we as people wish to satisfy a crowd. Whoever that crowd is, an aggressive crowd, a crowd we're wishing to impress, a crowd we wish to join, whatever. So here's a little collect written to the gods of Pilate. Gods of Pilate, you are loud and lazy, following the fashions of the day, making lies out of love and making mockeries of meaning. And so often we follow you. May we instead follow that small whisper, even when we barely hear it, even when we barely believe it, even when it hurts, because this is what love is. This is what love is. Amen. One of the things that I find in the form of collect is that it's got such a strict form, is that the form can hold itself and speak back to you. And you find things in form that you may not have expected. I find the same with sonnet. I went through 3 public exorcisms for being gay when I was 18, and I've recently, many years, 25 years later, begun to turn back to this experience, humiliating and frightening as it was. It's taken a quarter of a century to have the kind of distance from it to be able to turn towards it in art. And I turned towards it by writing a sequence called 7 Deadly Sonnets, exploring these. And the sonnets kept on refusing to hold the things that I wanted them to hold. I wanted the sonnet to hold the form where I was saying, I don't have any bloody demons. But the sonnet kept on saying, I won't say that, because in the sonnet you keep on having to trim because you're saying too much. And so I kept on needing to trim out those assertions that I was demonless. And it felt like the sonnet kept on saying back to me, the problem is that you just don't have one, you've got many. And the sonnet had its own wisdom. And I think form often does have its own wisdom. Marilyn Nelson is an extraordinary, you can call her a historical poet in the United States, and she speaks about how she is sometimes brought into places that wish to explore their racist history and their slave history. And she, as a descendant of the slaves, is brought in as an extraordinary acclaimed, she's a grand dame really of American letters, and she speaks about using terse and tight form because she's not sure she'd cope about writing about such horrors without the protection and the safety, is what she calls it, of form. I'm going to read you some more comments and then we can take a few questions and then we'll finish. I have loved the Stations of the Cross, again because their form. You find them particularly in the Catholic Church, although not exclusively. 14 images from the time that Jesus of Nazareth was arrested and brought before Pilate to the time that his corpse was laid in the tomb. Traditionally, well, there have been many versions of the Stations of the Cross, but in the last few centuries they've landed into those 14. In the last number of years, really since John Paul II was Pope, some churches have begun to put in a 15th one, the Resurrection. I always feel like that's a little bit annoying. I suppose they're welcome to do what they wish, but I'm interested in the slam in the gut of the reality that prayer can happen even when the end is awful, and that there's nonetheless, it's worthwhile living well, even when the end is going to be awful. That the imagination of a terrible end shouldn't diminish your integrity. And I think that's some of the great integrity of the Stations of the Cross, ending where they end. But we can have an argument about that later on over a pint if you're interested. So I've written 14 stations, 14 collects for the stations, and I'll read a few. This is for the first one. Jesus is condemned to death. God of the accused and the accusing, who made the mouths, the ears, and the hearts of all in conflict, may we turn ourselves toward that which must be heard, because there we will hear your voice. Amen. Jesus takes up the cross. Burdened God, who bore the weight of wood on torn shoulders, we pray for the torn and the burdened, that they may be held together by guts and goodness, because you were held together by guts and goodness. Amen. Here's Jesus meets his mother, the fourth station. Mary, mother of failure, you met your son at the end in a place beyond words, and must have felt faithless and empty and alone. We pray that we may have the grace to live with our own stories of failure, knowing that love can continue even when things end. Amen. One of my favourite stations is station number 6. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. I had a long period of serious immune disorder, and people, I was so, about 9 years, and I was so annoyed with people coming up and saying to you, how do you feel today? And I'm like, sick, leave me alone. And not that I said that often, but that's how I often felt. And one time, somebody came up to me in Mass and said, how do you feel today? And I said, not very well. And she said, can I say a prayer for you? And so she then said a prayer for me, Jesus made Pádraig better, or something like that. And she said at the end, do you feel better now? And I said, no, do you? And then I felt like an asshole, because that's what I was being. And then I was doing the Stations of the Cross, and I got to Veronica wipes the face of Jesus, and I imagined in this thing a conversation with my own life where this woman, I mean, it wasn't good help, but she was doing what she could, and there was me being an asshole back to her. I couldn't imagine Jesus of Nazareth saying to Veronica, "Do you feel better now, Veronica? On you go home. Congratulations." So here's a collect to Veronica. Veronica, your story is doubted but valuable. You did what you could, even though it was very little. May we do the same, even when we doubt. Amen. This is the 12th station. Jesus dies on the cross. Jesus of the imagination. You never grew old, always a young man, and most of us grow older than you did. When lives are cut short, the living question the meaning of living. May we live with meaning, even when meaning fades, making meaning so that we have something to live for. Amen. The second last one is Jesus is placed in the arms of his mother. Mary, mother of death, you held the corpse of your young son, the worst of fears, in your arms. As he went, where we have not yet gone. We mark this with silence and art. May we also learn from fear, because fear won't save us from anything. Amen. In the two that are addressed to Mary, Mary Mother of Failure, Mary Mother of Death, I am interested in ways within which this phrase, Mary Mother of, we see Mary Mother of Perpetual Sorrows, Mary Mother of Grace, Mary Mother of whatever, in these titles that are given to Mary, the Mother of Jesus, in particularly Marian devotion that you find spread across the Anglican and Catholic traditions, and the Orthodox tradition, obviously, too. And I'm interested in how we can populate that with unexpected ways. We often see Mary Mother of Purity or Mary Virgin of all virgins. I think if she exists, she must be pretty sick of those particular titles. And I'm interested in how it is that we can take her life seriously, to imagine somebody that knew and confronted death, knew and confronted deep and abject failure, and deep and abject isolation. I am interested in how prayer can echo that, because what that does then is it echoes our own lives, whether in poetry or in prayer or whatever that space in between is. How can the syntax and the imagination implied in our chosen syntax as well as form be something that tells the truth in a way that is serious and real? Because if nothing else, that'll give us an echo of a little song back towards ourselves, a little machine for remembering ourselves, for hearing ourselves, and being birthed into our own story. Here is the final collect, and then we'll take some questions. Jesus is placed in the tomb. Jesus of the unexpected. For at least some of your life, this was not how you imagined its end. Yet, even at the end, you kept steady in your conviction. Jesus, keep us steady. Jesus, keep us steady. Because Jesus, keep us steady. Amen. So let's have some questions. If you give me your name, that'll be lovely. Then I can forget it immediately.
Thank you so much. My name's Haroon. I was just wondering about whether you see any sort of, I often find as when I write poetry that I find a sort of conflict between, or tension between the prayer and the devotion and the process of writing poetry. And that there's, I mean, I think you've given us some really beautiful examples of how that tension is not inherent and it's sort of perhaps culturally learned, or it's something we kind of take on. But I often find that it lies in something like the expectation for kind of purity. And there's like a sort of Pablo Neruda quote where he said that people who like pure poetry will fall on their faces in the snow. But in a way, these poems have given us that in their sort of simplicity. They are quite pure, they have purity about them. So I wonder if that's a conflict that you see as well as a lot of people trying to write poetry that isn't so pure, that has lots of stuff in it and lots of the chaos of daily life and lots of kind of reality in it in that way. And how can those things be kind of brought together? How can that conflict be kind of eased?
Did you say your name is Haru?
Harun.
Harun. So, you're giving me a couple of different definitions of purity there, which I think is very interesting. Purity in terms of simplicity of form, and simplicity of form that actually opens up the conflict at the heart of the poem or the prayer. And I'm really interested in that kind of purity. I kind of blame the Psalms for a lot of bad poetry, because in some of the Psalms you see, life is terrible, it's awful, you know, terror rains down upon me from the right, terror rains down upon me from the left, my enemies rise up against me, I see the good die lonely and the bad die well, but I will praise you, O Lord. I'm so bored by that ending. I just find myself wanting to go, really? Like, is that in any way adequate? And I want to know, what does a prayer look like, or a poem look like, that doesn't resolve itself with that kind of imagination of purity? To my mind, that's like treating the Lord God Almighty like somebody who you can't trust to cope with your sense of distress. And if there is a God, God better be able to cope with distress, because God's to blame for lots of it. And so we need to have a way within which our prayer can reflect adequately and intelligently something that implies that if we do trust a maker, that we can give to that maker everything that we know of the chaos of the world. And I think that kind of imagined purity feels saccharine, and I find it to be inadequate regularly. I tend to get a lot of people, and I love who write to me with some of their poetry. I really love that, and especially the overlap between poetry and religion and prayer. And often I might write back and say, see that last verse? What would happen if you erased it, if you got rid of it? What would happen if we ended there? What would happen if we had a different understanding of resolve? Some of you, I'm sure, will be talented musicians, and you can look at ways within which all kinds of music introduces unexpected things in its final resolve. I think of Joni Mitchell's song, A Case of You, that it ends on a chord that has been nowhere present in the entire sequence of the piece. And I think there's something really interesting about this idea of resolve. And so I suppose that's my response, Harun, is that I really do like the idea of purity, of intention and clarity, but I think that conflict is pure, and to let the conflict speak rather than to try to resolve the conflict is something that's really interesting in the space of this. Any other questions?
I'm Simon. I also have a slightly unhealthy interest in collects, and from a sort of a slightly deep liturgical perspective.
Are you the president or the secretary of the club? Because there's only
so I suppose my question is about how a community or a church discovers and articulates a liturgical voice. So I've been involved in drafting some text that the Church of England uses in contemporary worship, and we're stuck with a sort of a tension. So for us, our liturgy expresses our doctrine. So because that has to be the case, the texts can't be too ambiguous, they need to be clear. At the same time, we're asked to make our text as accessible as possible, but we also want to articulate a sort of an authentic voice, and discover what the authentic voice might be for our generation. And the way in which the Church of England sort of got away from that is taking Cranmer's collects and just sticking them in modern English, which I think is sort of a mock Tudor sort of thing, is not really an answer. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that sort of dilemma which we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I have definite thoughts, because I have been bored by some of the collects that I've seen in the new ones.
Sorry.
I'm sure they weren't the ones that you wrote. I think the New Zealand Church are doing some very interesting things. If any of you are interested in simply the poetry of liturgy, whatever we think about its divine claims, the New Zealand Church have been for a long time releasing some really, really innovative prayers and liturgies, partly I think because of a civic and public commitment towards, in the small gestures that are possible, being informed by a Maori sensibility in regarding language. And so I think that's a really interesting thing, because there's a post-colonial critique that comes into that too. And so some of the constructs that they're using in English are informed by Maori construct, and that in itself I think is really, really interesting. The other thing, and partly this is related because what the New Zealand Church are doing is in conversation with a broad and lamenting narrative, i.e. and celebrating as well as lamenting for everything that's lost through colonisation, the Maori narrative. And I think that the biblical witness is so filled with contradictory voices that I don't understand why doctrine can't be contradictory, because I feel like that's often unfaithful to the biblical text. And I often think that prayer writers aren't brave enough, not because I want them to be kind of disruptive, chaotic poets, but because if prayer writers are writing prayers that in some way are a response and an engagement with the biblical text, in the biblical text we see all kinds of horror. We see all kinds of apocalypse, all kinds of terrors that are not finally resolved. A friend of mine who grew up in refugee camps, he was one of the lost boys of Sudan. 20,000 walked, half of them died. He grew up in many, many camps on various sides of the Kenyan and Ethiopian and Sudanese borders. And he said, I love the book of Revelation because it makes me feel like I know what this is like. And I find it fascinating that he turns to these complicated texts, a text that Martin Luther was saying, get rid of it, don't keep it inside. But he turns to that, and not because it gives an answer, but because it gives an echo. He finds in the echo of chaos something that corresponds to the story of his life. And I'm really interested in prayer like that, and the understanding, the muscular assertion that that too is doctrine. So I haven't thought about this at all. And then somebody over here to... Okay, yeah.
My name's Alice. If you could speak a moment to those of us who are involved in kind of the academic study or the teaching of poetry, and I wondered whether you could talk a bit about how we might keep that sense of wonder and imagination and creativity alongside the kind of necessary work of teaching students to kind of dissect poems.
Yeah.
And I sometimes kind of feel like I'm kind of sitting and making them there, kind of go through all the structure and the meter so something about how we might keep the imagination and the creativity alongside that.
It's such a lovely question. I mean, I live and breathe for poetry. A day for me is not adequate without the reading of poetry, and I do think that some of it is about asking questions that mean you can open a door into a poem and see something wondrous there first. That the first thing you do before the technical deconstruction of it is that you can begin to walk into a poem and see everything that's there, as well as see what the poem says back to you. So this interesting question, if this poem were a room, what kind of room would it be? Is it a furnished room? Is it a room that's had a bomb in it? Has that bomb gone off? Is there anybody in the room? Are there photographs on the wall? Are the photographs gaudy or gaudy? Are the photographs of any interest? What would you do there? Would you want to stay there? Would you feel safe in that room? And then from that, the idea really is that when you begin to deconstruct the poem, that each aspect of the poem, its enjambment, its titlement, its way of dividing up verses from verses, etc., that each of them reveal the heart of the poem. And sometimes through an imaginative question you can get to the heart of it, and then you go, okay, now let's ask a few technical questions that will just keep on bringing us back to that same heart, but that people know that the technical question is never the uncovering of the heart of the poem. While not all poetry is written for this, I am particularly interested in poetry that's written with hunger at the heart of it, with need. Why did the poet need to write this poem? And the corresponding question is what kind of poem would I need to write? And so a conversation between the person, I suppose it's the engagement of rhetoric or reader response, to take a theological particularity from that, and to look at the space between poet-reader and poet-writer, and looking at the new self that's created in the space between those. I do love asking people to say, if you could change a line in this poem, what would you do? Because it's a really interesting critique to see what people say. I do the same thing with biblical narratives. With the prodigal son once, with a bunch of young people who had no interest in religion, we read that and said, if you could change one thing in this story, what would you change? It was great, it was so exciting what they said. William Carlos Williams' poem, This Is Just to Say, is such an interesting one to say, what do you think and how could you write a response to it? I mean, it's a horrible poem. This is just to say, I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox that you were obviously saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cool. An apology letter to his wife, apparently. And that poem, with no visible meter or rhyme or structure, has its music continues on. So I've worked with 10-year-olds in English and in Irish to say, write your version. And it's amazing what menacing little bastards 10-year-olds are. It's unbelievable. One girl in one of the class said, I wrote this to my best friend, but I'm pretending she's not my best friend. And she said, this is just to say, I have stolen your dog that I know you love, and I've given it a new name. I'm not sorry at all. Behold the dark heart of the world, open it to us. And this idea she knew, I have given it a new name. Who taught her that that's always the thing? You steal language first, and when you steal language, then you have won most of everything. Whether that's literally, the Irish language was made illegal in the 1800s, or whether that's in other ways by saying, we have a new name for you now. We will use our name for you, not your name for you. And so there's all kinds of ways in which I think to get into the drama and the energy of the poem, and then to look at the technicalities is all kind of leading you back to that. How do the technicalities show us the heart of this poem rather than the other way around? It's a long answer, but anyway.
Thank you.
You tell me to shut up?
No, question.
Oh, right.
That's all right, yeah. Jared. I have a question about, so thinking about poetry as prayer, and how you spoke very eloquently at the beginning about finding that you sort of alongside the I, or with the I, or in the I of the poem as well. A lot of prayer is silence, and poetry always involves words. But are there ways in which, or how do we think about silent prayer? And I'm thinking particularly maybe not just contemplation, but when we can't find words to pray, how it might be poetry. Maybe, particularly I think, how we might experience in a period of loss or something when we can find nothing to say, what that might mean in regards to poetry.
Yeah, it's a lovely question. I am so interested in words and writing and space on the page, and then blank space on the page too, that I think that's partially the reason that I'm so interested in poetry, is because poetry is as much written by what's not written and all the empty space on the page as by the words that are chosen. And I mean, poems that are trying to be adequate by saying everything usually end up being accused of not being poems, because people say, oh, for God's sake, you're just writing prose, you know, just write a list. And so I think that there can be something really interesting in seeing the empty space on a page of poetry or prayer as saying as much, and what poetry knows about the placing of poems on the page. And Jane Mead is a contemporary poet, and she has an amazing book called World of Made and Unmade, lovely picking out from the Creed. And she is not an overly devotional poet, but she's very interested in religion. And her first book is called Concerning the Lord and the General Din of the World, which is a magnificent title for a book, and I bought the book just because of that title. And a hot guy told me about the book, so I bought it. So, but in it, she continually places poems in all kind of positions, aligning them to the left or to the right or to the centre or to the bottom or to the top, slightly changing the size, using italics. And when you read that book, and it was nominated for some big prizes, World of Made and Unmade, you see over and over again the amount of emptiness that's there and loneliness. And I mean, as I'm thinking about loss, my best friend took his own life when we were both 24, and I was living on the other side of the planet. I was living in Australia, and I got a phone call too late I couldn't have afforded to have come home anyway, but I also got a phone call too late to have come home to Ireland, even if I did have the money. And I left about 10 pages blank in the diary that I keep. And just in the middle of the 5th page, I wrote a quote from Lord of the Rings. which is when the fellowship, who are now only 8, not 9, end up in Lothlorien, and the elves are singing laments for Gandalf, the Thrandir as they call him, and some of the other company are asking Legolas the elf to translate, and he says that he wouldn't because the matter is too near a matter for grief and not yet for words. So I wrote that on about the 5th page of those 10 blank pages, and I still, on his anniversary, turn back to those pages and look at all the empty space there, which for me, on a poetics level as well as a kind of a literary prayer level, is the equivalent of silence and the things that simply can't be said, not kind of lovely restorative, meditative silence, but a silence of anguish. And I'm always interested in, when you look at a volume of poetry, how they've managed the empty space on the page, some of which does depend as to how much of an investment the publisher is willing to put in to the artistic arrangement. But more and more publishers, I think, are very interested in putting all of that in there. Raymond Antrobus is an extraordinary poet, British Jamaican guy, and he released his first collection, published through Penned in the Margins a few weeks ago, and he is deaf, and he there's a clumsy Ted Hughes poem that was written hastily after Ted Hughes paid a visit to a school for the deaf, and so he has that poem there apparently, but it's entirely redacted, and then he has the response to it. And so there's Penned in the Margins, just some really innovative experiments really with space, with blank space, as well as then redacted space in the context of poetry. And I think all of that is corresponding a little bit to what you're saying, I hope.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I'll just something that I thought of during the talk. There was this, I was in a pub once, and August really started with that, and I met this French guy, and basically he talked about sex a lot. That was his main thing. It seemed to be like the stereotype.
This is a great story.
And we got to talking about religion, and he was of Arabic descent, and he said the only thing he said about it was, he seemed a bit better about it, but the only thing he said was, I think that people are too stupid to know what God wants. And I thought, that's quite an amazing thing to hear in a pub from someone who you know, people do surprise you. That's what was nice about it. But also the idea that God could want anything seemed quite strange, because you know the sort of archaic sort of use of want is lack. What could God lack?
Yeah.
And it made me think of, well, I was brought up Catholic, but I've lapsed somewhat. And but I like religious interpretation, especially like G.K. Chesterton's idea that the Old Testament is about the loneliness of God, and that he's like a rich guy in his mansion playing with like this creation, that he's his toy trains and all that, and somehow he's just like, it's not enough in some way.
Yeah.
And the idea that at the end of the book of Job, he's basically saying, I don't know what I did. You know, that's why he throws all those questions at him. I'm just wondering what you would think about that, whether God lacked something.
Yeah, the question about desire is a really interesting thing, because to desire something, to want something, opens up the question about whether desire is ever fulfilled by the achievement of that desire, whether desire is an end in and of itself. I think there's a rich philosophy, which I find impenetrable, but there's a rich poetics of desire, which I think is really worthwhile exploring. And the answer for me is I don't know what I think of that. I cannot imagine, if we are to imagine that humankind is created in some kind of divine image, I cannot imagine that loneliness is just a symbol of our limitation. I think loneliness is part of the divine breath, and so God has to be lonely, if there is a God, in order for us to have the manifestation of that and the dignity of that. The Irish word for loneliness is uidneach, coming from the word for uig, which is the word for grave, and so loneliness is a foretaste of your own death. It's a little death, in a way. And I think there is great wisdom in the understanding of that, that in order to live a mature life, that you have to come to a sophisticated relationship with your own loneliness, and that the lack of that will lead to a limited life. And so, yeah. I think I'd have liked to have been part of that conversation because it's a very...
I was waiting, you didn't put it that way.
Any other questions? We have one more? Or?
Yeah, if there is one.
I'll try and articulate it. My name is Arjia, and just been thinking recently about sacred verses and how there's a line, I think, from Isaiah. He says that, like, the word of God does not return to God void. And this idea of these sort of creative energies that are imbued within these words. And I'm a member of the Baha'i faith, and sometimes I find myself reading these prayers, and after I read something, it gives birth to a poem inside me, and that I need to speak out. And there's this kind of dialogue that happens between the words that I've read, and then a poem that comes out. And I was just curious about sort of your personal experience with sacred verses and kind of mapping that with poetry, and how that would then result into a particular action in your day-to-day life, or in a relationship with someone. Yeah, is that clear?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I'm not sure about the action, but I find a real echo in what you're saying. Did I get your name right? Arjia?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you kind of botched that, but one of the interesting things that you find in the imagination of the biblical writers is this obsession with words. So in the poet who wrote Genesis chapter 1, the poet clearly had an understanding of the power of syntax, because they put into this character of God that they're writing this creative energy that when God says something, something happens. And so one of the things that when God names something, and one of the things that then in Genesis 2, written by a different poet, but continued on really, is that the Adam character, the man character, is being asked to name things also. And so we see this idea of putting names on something as one of the original divine actions that's seen. And I think that is the beginning of poetics, the beginning of the need to put something into words, whether that's in writing or just in speech, whether to other people or to yourself. To name something is in of itself an echo of some kind of divine imagination that we have in us. And so much so that it's projected in the Genesis narrative into being amongst the first things that God does to create the everything that is. And so in that way, I think it makes so much sense that to read anything will cause a response. And I'm always interested when I work with poets or young poets to say, who do you read where when you finish what you're reading, you find yourself writing? And to ask that question and then to say, let's just do more of that. We don't even have to understand why, because I'm not really interested in understanding the why, but I'm really interested in understanding for people to go, look, when I can barely finish a book of this person's work before I'm scribbling in the back of the book or scribbling in my own notebook or whatever it is, or listening to a person's music, or I think it's a similar thing with artists, that they see somebody and they begin to mimic. And mimicry is a great response mechanism. We find ourselves being drawn into a language, a body language, or that's being shaped. And I think there's something very powerful in that that's really worthwhile paying attention to. And if it's religious literature that does so, I think it brings us into the idea that when those texts were put together, there once was somebody who did the same thing. Isaiah, Ezekiel, whoever these people are, the author of the book of Ruth, the author of the book of Esther, they were moved to write something, and to do so is always audacious. Always audacious. And they were no more qualified than we were to try to put God into ink. And they tried, and it's worthwhile paying attention to that, and that we are primarily, I think, dealing with artists when we engage with inherited texts. Later on we can look at doctrine and theology and all these other things. But they start off as artists, and art is lonely. Anybody here who's involved in art knows that, you know, it's written alone, and you are always wondering, will anybody read this? Do they need to? Can I read it? Will it read me back? And so, yeah, I suppose that's what I want to say. I'll finish with a poem, I think. Whenever we release this, I wonder if we'll be able to strike off the end of this bit because I'm going to finish with a few poems about that are responding to what you were just asking. I've got a new collection that I'm close to finishing that the first section of it engages with the Genesis texts in the beginning and Adam and Eve and all those kind of things. So here's one, I'll read a few for you, they're short. Here's one called Fiction. Made to make my maker, I had a tongue, some words, and a pen. Needing ink and inspiration, I sliced skin and wrote. In the beginning, God was nothing but a word. Before the beginning, nobody said, let there be darkness, because it was already there. Because everything started from nothing. The light shines, but the darkness got there first. Nothing said something, but nobody was yet. Was this the beginning or the end? The curse or the cure? Shh. Something's moving something. It's probably nothing. Just the wind. And the last one, called Make Believe. And this is with thanks for the generosity of the invitation, the generosity of your listening and your contribution. Many thanks, it's a real honour to be here. So we'll finish with this. And there's going to be an announcement, I think. There's some poetry in the pub later on, which will be great. And I'm delighted to chat to any of you afterwards too. This one is called Make Believe. And on the first day, God made something up. Then everything came along. Seconds, sex, and beasts, and breaths, and rabies, hunger, healing, lust and lust's rejections, swarming things that swarm inside the dearth, girth and grind and grit and shit and all shit's functions, rings inside the treetop trunk and branches broken by the snow, pigs' hearts and stars, mystery, suspense and stingrays, insects, blood and interests and death, eventually us with all our viruses, laments and curiosities, all our songs and made-up stories, and our songs about the stories we've forgotten, and all that we've forgotten, and the clock. Thank you very much.